Hello, this week I'm taking over for Pastor Bart for a series of Lenten studies, and I'm going to talk especially about the theme of the Passover or the Exodus in the book of Mark. But to do that, I want to give an overview of the Old Testament with an emphasis on the Exodus. So that's what we're going to look at today. The Passover is a celebration of the central event in the Old Testament, which is called the Exodus. It's also the name of the second book of the Bible, the Exodus, which means a way out. And the Exodus is the story of how God rescues his people, the descendants of Abraham, who have been slaves in Egypt for over 400 years. So this is kind of the storyline of Israel. And what I have here on the board is the Old Testament story of Israel that starts in the book of Genesis with God's promise to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, of descendants, land, and blessing. But they end up as slaves in Egypt. Though they multiply and become numerous, they're still slaves. And then they cry out to God, and God rescues them from Egypt in the event called the Exodus. Either in the 1200s or 1400s, there's debate about the exact date. Then they go into the wilderness. And over here we see Egypt. The wilderness is in the Sinai Peninsula. And this is the promised land up here. So they spend 40 years in the wilderness, and it's a difficult time as they live kind of on the edge of survival, needing God to provide water and food or manna so that they can be kept alive. One of the big events in the wilderness is that God gives them the law, the Ten Commandments and other laws on Mount Sinai. And that becomes kind of the defining constitution and rule to live by that Israel has and receives in the wilderness. So then at the end of this, under Joshua, they're led into the promised land. So this would be 1200s or earlier if we take the 1400s date. And then they live in the promised land up until 586. And during this time, they're living beginning around 1000 with kings. First Saul, and then David and David's descendants. And we have the period of the monarchy or kings. We also have a temple that's built in Jerusalem where the worship of God is centered. So they live in this promised land until the 6th century, the 500s, and are overcome by the Babylonians and taken as hostages or slaves again, as it were, into exile in Babylon. And over on the map, we see Babylon is over here in Mesopotamia. There's the city of Babylon. So they're taken from here over to Babylon. And they live there for a number of decades, and they are allowed to return through an edict of the Persian king Cyrus in 539. The Persians defeated the Babylonians, and Cyrus allows them to return. And so we have kind of these bright spots in Israel's story, the promise of a land and descendants and so on, and then the fulfillment of the promise as they live in the land of Israel, and then the return home. As we live today, maybe you would like to review the story of the Exodus. You could read in the book of Exodus, chapters especially 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and you'll see there the account of God's rescue of his people as we read about the end of the plagues and then ultimately the rescue at the Red Sea where the Egyptians are drowned in the sea.